Hi guys, yeah, sorry it's been a while since I put a video up. I've been doing quite a bit of one-to-one training videos for people, but here we go. And we're not talking about raw therapy today, we're talking about Lightroom. Yes, we are. And if I head over to my YouTube channel and to a particular video, I always try and reply to the majority of people who leave a comment, and I do read them all. And Greg Balding left this question. Just learning Lightroom, so I'm blah 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 blah. Yes, thank you very much, Greg. He's got a problem. He's trying to do my process version swap within Lightroom, or the current edition of Lightroom. It's now up to process version 5, but that should be okay. The problem I have is I can't work out how to zero the settings after going to version 2. I've also got a comment down here from Lazos, lovely gent from Greece, and he's got the newest version of Lightroom, and he says there's no such preset as zeroed anymore. There is, guys. It's just that Adobe have hidden it from you. Yeah. So if I come back over to Lightroom, and whenever I want to describe or demonstrate anything in Lightroom, I do quite often roll out this shot because it's got the lot. It's shot on a very, very sunny day with the sun to me back. So we've got a bright blue sky, we've got lots of white fluffy clouds, we've got a glossy white car immediately in the foreground, and a lot of deep shadow. So in other words, it's a very, very, very high contrast shot. And this is the raw file brought straight into Lightroom. And I know the modern trend today with social media images is bags and bags of contrast. But contrast is thine enemy unless you get it under control. Now, the first thing I wanted to address was people reckon that the zeroed preset is missing, and it isn't. If we go to this little plus icon next to presets where it says add new preset, we can create presets, we can import presets, but we can also manage presets. If you click on manage presets, I forget what this looks like by default, but if you'll notice, if we scroll down, we have user presets right at the bottom. I don't work with video in Lightroom, so I have that unchecked. But this is by default, I'm pretty certain, unchecked. Classic General. So put a check mark in there. Take out check marks that are already in there by default, which you might not want, and then just go and click Save. All right. And under Classics General, when you open it back up, you will see at the bottom zeroed. Now, if we look at the histogram, we can see we're quite close over to the right hand side, but we've got no clipping. Now, if I just click the little clipping indicator there, you'll notice that we've got these red splodges. Okay, now these red splodges are indicating clipping, but what they are is specular highlights, and you can't rebuild specular highlights in Lightroom no matter what anybody tells you. You just can't. You can go and spot them out in Photoshop, which is the usual way of doing it. And if you use something like raw therapy, you can quite often remove specular highlights with using highlight compression and what do you call it? I've forgotten now. But you can actually fill certain speculars in, but not all of them. And if the pixels have literally overloaded in the sensor, even raw therapy can't fill them in properly. It's a job for Photoshop. But here's the thing. We've got no clipping in the highlights showing in the clipping indicator in the histogram. But we have got clipped highlights. Okay? So that's one sort of negative for Lightroom. It sort of ignores specular highlights. which is sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. If you know they're there, you don't really need telling about them. But if you don't know they're there, it would be a good idea if Lightroom actually did point them out. So always remember that if you suspect specular highlights, even though you've got no clipping showing here, just go and click on that little up arrow there and it will show you the speculars. But you'll notice I've got clipping in the shadows, alright? And it's because the up arrow is red, it means there's clipping at the dark end of the red channel. Now, because we've got this zeroed preset now available to us, if we notice the profile that Lightroom is using by default is Adobe Color. If I hit zeroed now, you'll notice it changes back to Adobe Standard. The image changes a little bit. You'll notice that the wall comes up in, it sort of comes up in brightness but goes a little bit flat. But now you'll notice that the dark end histogram clipping in the red channel has disappeared. But what we're going to do is just step back because we don't really need that. And I'll put this back to its imported defaults. Okay, so now you can see we've got Adobe Color back and we've got our little red clipping indicator in the shadows for the red channel. So what we want to do, now we've addressed the fact that neither Greg nor Lazos could see the actual zeroed preset, now we know how we can get that zeroed preset back by going into Manage Presets, okay? So I'm just going to run everybody through what I class as a good process on this, what is, to all intents and purposes, a god-awful image. But as I said before, it's useful for demo purposes. If we come down to the calibration panel, we'll see we're in process version 5. If I now switch that back to process version 2, yeah, now you can see I've got clipped shadows and I've got more clipping in the highlights. If we come back to the basics panel, you see now we've got the original Lightroom basics panel controls. And you can see that even though Lightroom said there was nothing happening in the background to this image, you can actually see that it's put quite a few adjustments on in the background. But these aren't the adjustments that I really argue about within Lightroom. And, you know, if we're going to carry on doing this process version swap, what we need to do is zero out all these controls. So we can either zero them out like that and just bring everything down to 0, or we could just go and hit zeroed. Yes, we can. Alrighty. But that, in doing that, what we'll do is switch everything back to process version 5, which is not something we want to do. So we'll go back to process version 2, but because we hit that 0 panel, you'll see now all the sliders are set to 0. What we need to do is come to this tone curve. Now, what purported to be a linear tone curve in Lightroom actually isn't. It's a medium contrast tone curve. So what we need to do is to come to this little up and down arrow here and switch this back to a linear tone curve. And then all we're going to do is just go into detail. We'll put the sharpening back on and we'll put the color noise back on. And we'll come to lens corrections, we'll go remove chromatic aberration, bump, or rather like that, and then we'll come back to calibration and we'll switch this back to process version 5. And there we go. And then what I would recommend you do is to come over to presets, yep, and just go create preset and just call it process version swap. Make sure you've got everything ticked there, or call it PV swap or whatever you want to do, and just go and click create and it will drop in here in your user presets. Okay, so we'll just click cancel on there. And so now we've got a quite dull flat image, but you know, other than the little speculars here in the car headlights, we haven't really got a lot wrong with the image. So all we're going to do is to bring the exposure back up and bring the contrast back up, And I'm just going to activate my, whoops, they were already activated, weren't they? Just going to make sure that the clipping indicators are active. And then what I'm going to do now is just try and bring back a little bit of shape and form to this car bonnet here, this Renault Megane, and also bring a bit of contrast back in and a bit of saturation. So let's start with colour first. And so I'm just going to lift the vibrance slider up a little bit, and maybe the saturation slider a little smidge as well. And then I'm going to get the highlight slider and I'm going to move it to the left. And you can see I'm bringing back a little bit of shape and form in the car bonnet of this Renault here. And one thing is, you don't want to take this back too far. You also, if I'm bringing the highlights to the left, I tend to leave the shadow slider alone. It wouldn't really affect this image quite so much, but when you've got an image with a lot of ultrafine detail in, you can actually start generating halos around high contrast edges if you move the highlights too far to the left and the shadows too far to the right. But there you go. So what I'm now going to do is just bring the white slider down a little bit. Okay. And I'm going to attempt to do a rough white balance on the image just by picking up the white balance tool and coming into here, this grey area. And yeah, we've sort of white balanced the image. You'll notice I've still got the clipping indicators active, but now we haven't got any clipping showing. How cool's that? What else do we need to do? It might actually be a good idea to start lifting the exposure a little bit. And then just as soon as you start to see these little white clipping red clipping marks coming in the highlights, just back it off, because what we're trying to do is put a bit of bulk in the old histogram. And then the only other way we can add contrast now is to start to drop the blacks, because you'll notice the blacks are at plus 25. So I'm going to bring those down to, let's say, +1, and we'll see if we can bring them down any further. And you can just see, just in the bottom corner there, we're just starting to generate some clipping in the blacks. It's in the extreme shadows. Print-wise, it's doubtful if you'd even notice that, but I'm just going to back it off until those clipping indicators are gone. I'll ignore that little tiny bit there. And so, there you go. Yeah, hey, let's go and add a little bit more vibrance to the image. Let's maybe see if saturation makes a lot of difference. There we go. And I might just warm the image up just a little bit, rather like that. So if you want to see a before and after, there we go. That's what the image looked like before. Shadows way too dark, can't see inside them. And way too much contrast. And now we're back on an even playing field with good colour, good saturation, a pretty good white balance. And yeah, no clipping in the shadows or the highlights. Do we now want to add some contrast? Yes, we do, but we don't want to add it at the top end of the histogram. That's the highlights, and we don't want to add it at the bottom end of the histogram. That's the shadows. So if we want to increase contrast in Lightroom but leave that shadows and highlights where they are, what do we do? Yes, clarity. So all we're going to do is just add a little bit of clarity in there, and there we go. So just plus 22 clarity, and let's go and have a look at the before and after. There we go. There's the before, there's the after. So there you go, guys. I hope that's answered everybody's questions over where the zeroed preset has suddenly disappeared to. And again, it's an illustration of how to create a process version swap. And of course, that process version swap, when you do imports into Lightroom, you can actually set that process version swap to be active on all the images as they're imported onto your hard drive. So there you go, guys and gals. Hope that's proved useful to you. Hope you found it interesting, and hope it's answered everybody's questions around process version swaps and the disappearance of the zeroed user preset. Okay, guys, stay safe, stay well, keep taking the pictures, and I'll speak to you very soon. Tooroo.